16 years old. The average age of the soldier who fought in Normandy within the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend during the summer of 1944. 16 years old. The age at which a European today studies mathematics, argues about football, and learns to drive. The age at which those German boys stopped cold the advance of battle-hardened Canadian veterans from North Africa and Italy, inflicted thousands of casualties, held for weeks a front that Allied command had expected to break in hours, and died by the tens of thousands in the mud of France, convinced they were dying for something sacred. They were not soldiers who had been handed a rifle. They were children who had been handed an identity, and that difference explains everything. To understand what the Hitlerjugend SS was, one must first understand what the Hitlerjugend itself was. The Hitler Youth were not a paramilitary organization in the conventional sense of the term. They were a total system of human transformation designed to produce a type of German that had never existed before. Founded in 1922 as the youth wing of the National Socialist Party, reorganized and massified under the leadership of Baldur von Schirach after the seizure of power in January 1933, the Hitlerjugend had an objective that its own ideologues stated without ambiguity and without shame in their official publications. Not to create good Germans, to create a new German. A man who would not know doubt, who would not comprehend defeat as a real possibility, who would identify his personal existence with the existence of the Reich to the point where the distinction between the two disappeared entirely. A man whose loyalty was not a decision, but a biological condition installed before he could question it. The system was total because it was continuous. There was no temporal or spatial escape within Nazi Germany. The German child of 10 entered the Deutsches Jungvolk, the youngest section of the organization. At 14, he moved into the Hitlerjugend proper, where he remained until 18. Girls followed a parallel path in the Jungmädelbund and subsequently in the Bund Deutscher Mädel. Membership was formally voluntary until December 1936, when the Hitler Youth Law made it compulsory for all Germans between 10 and 18 years of age. Non-membership equated to social exclusion, employment problems for parents, and progressively direct intervention by party authorities. In practice, by 1938, non-membership had ceased to be a real option for the majority of German families unless they were prepared to accept serious consequences. By 1939, the organization counted 8,700,000 registered members. An entire generation had grown up with no other reference for collective identity than the movement. Without alternative political parties, without churches holding real authority over young people, without rival youth organizations that could offer a different sense of belonging. The Hitlerjugend was everything. The summer camps in the Bavarian forests with nights around the fire and songs that spoke of blood and soil, the torchlit parades through cities, the shooting, orienteering and athletics competitions that rivaled school sports in seriousness, the courses in first aid, navigation and topography that gave them the feeling of learning things that real men learned. The genuine, authentic camaraderie born of sharing the same physical effort and the same open air with the boys from the village or the neighborhood. The system enveloped the child from the age of 10 and did not let go. What that system produced was not exactly fanaticism in the vulgar sense of an uncontrolled emotion that could be extinguished by reason. It was something closer to a structural certainty installed in layers too deep to be reached by argument. The Reich was eternal. The German race was superior. The debt owed to those who fell in the Great War demanded vengeance and victory. Sacrifice for the Führer was the highest meaning to which a human life could aspire. These were not propositions that young people in the Hitlerjugend debated or evaluated against alternatives. They were the ground beneath their feet. One does not argue with the ground. One does not ask it to justify its existence. It is simply there, and one walks upon it. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS, understood before anyone else what that meant in specific military terms. A generation that had grown up entirely within that system did not need to be indoctrinated to fight. It already was, with a depth and consistency that no military training program could produce in adults. It only needed structure, technical armament, and an enemy to aim at. The rest had been done since the age of 10. The idea of creating an SS division composed exclusively of Hitlerjugend members was born in Himmler's offices during the summer of 1942, at the precise moment when the war on the Eastern Front began to reveal its true nature with a clarity that could no longer be denied by any optimistic analysis. Stalingrad had not yet fallen, but the signs were there for anyone willing to read them. Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS casualties on the Eastern Front were astronomical. Between June 1941 and December 1942, the German army had suffered more than 1,200,000 killed on the Soviet front alone. Divisions that had crossed the Pripyat marshes with full complements in the summer of 1941 were returning to Germany to re-equip with a third of their original strength. The conventional replacement system, which recruited men between 18 and 45 with reasonably rigorous medical and aptitude standards, could not cover that hemorrhage. And there was a human reserve available of millions of young people between 15 and 17 years of age, perfectly organized, physically trained through years of systematic exercise, and psychologically prepared by more than a decade of continuous indoctrination to believe that dying for the Führer and for the Reich was not only acceptable, but desirable, the most glorious fate to which a young German could aspire in history. On the 6th of June 1942, exactly 2 years before D-Day, a calendrical coincidence that Himmler found symbolically satisfying, the Reichsführer SS formally ordered the creation of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. Command fell to Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, a 35-year-old officer whose career summarized everything the Waffen-SS had been since 1939. A veteran of the Polish campaigns, where SS units had participated in documented massacres of civilians. A veteran of the 1940 French campaign, where he had commanded assault units that broke French lines on the Somme. A veteran of the Greek front and the first 2 years of combat on the Eastern Front, where the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the division to which Witt had belonged, had accumulated a record of military victory and war crime in proportions that the Nuremberg trials would never fully process. Witt was competent, hard, and loved by his men, with the kind of loyalty generated only by an officer who shares danger at the front line. He had seen what war did to men across 3 years of continuous combat. Now his job was to take children and turn them into those kinds of men in the shortest time possible. Recruitment began in the autumn of 1942 at a pace that reflected the urgency of the project. Calls went out across Germany, Austria, the Sudetenland incorporated in 1938, and the Reich's territories in the West. Volunteers born in 1926 were sought, 17 or turning 17, with certified physical fitness, active membership in the Hitlerjugend, and a character record that local party officials were required to validate. The response was massive. In the first weeks, tens of thousands of young men presented themselves at recruitment centers. The division was oversubscribed before the first day of formal training had begun. The reasons they signed up represent one of the historical questions that researchers have debated most carefully and with least definitive consensus, because the answers prove equally uncomfortable for those who wish to see these boys only as victims of a system and for those who wish to see them only as perpetrators of crimes. Part of the answer is sociological and fairly direct. In Germany in 1942, the social, family, and community environment made not signing up practically unthinkable for most young men who met the requirements. Fathers applied pressure, teachers pointed the way, neighbors observed, the party recorded and remembered. Refusing was tantamount to marking oneself and one's entire family as disloyal to the Reich, with consequences that in that year could range from exclusion from any professional or educational opportunity to the arrest of a family member on grounds that could always be found if one looked for them. The context left little room for refusal. But another part of the answer is harder to accommodate in a comfortable narrative. Many genuinely wanted to go. They had grown up with war as a glorious backdrop across every possible channel of communication. Their older brothers served on the Eastern Front and came home on leave with iron crosses and stories that distance and pride made more heroic than they had been. The Deutsche Wochenschau newsreels, shown in every German cinema before every film, displayed columns of armor advancing across endless steppes and captured cities with their flags brought down. Teachers spoke of the historical destiny of German youth. Textbooks described those who fell in combat as the most honored of all Germans. War was adventure, honor, camaraderie, and destiny. And the Hitlerjugend SS was the elite within the elite, the unit where the best young men of the Reich were going to write the most brilliant page in 20th century German history. Siegfried Müller, who enlisted in the division at 17 in 1943 and fought in Normandy as a gunner in a Panzer IV, would describe it 4 decades later with a frankness his contemporaries rarely achieved in public. Müller stated in an interview recorded by German historian Gerhard Rempel in 1987, "I wanted to go. We all wanted to go. None of us knew what real war was. Not the real thing, with the smell and the cold and the dead that don't get collected for days. We thought we were going to do what we'd done at the Hitlerjugend camps, but with real weapons and a real enemy and medals at the end. We were idiots. We were children who believed that war was like the night exercises in the Thuringian forest, but with more adrenaline and more glory." The division's main training camp was established at Beverloo in occupied Belgium in the spring of 1943. It was at Beverloo that the division received the definitive character that would make it unlike any other formation in the German army, and where the most determining decision of its entire operational history took place: the selection of the officer who would shape it from the ground up and give it its combat doctrine. Obersturmbannführer Kurt Meyer arrived at Beverloo in the early months of 1943 with a reputation that preceded his physical presence by several days. Meyer was 33 years old and had served in the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler Division from the first hours of the war in Poland. He was known throughout the Waffen-SS officer corps by a nickname that summarized his entire philosophy, Panzermeyer, and by a series of episodes that circulated from barracks to barracks and that young officers recounted with a mixture of genuine admiration and something that in any other context would have been called fear. In the Balkans, when his men hesitated before a well-defended Greek position at the Klissura Pass, Meyer pulled out a fragmentation grenade, activated it, and rolled it across the ground behind his own soldiers. The choice was simple: either advance or the grenade kills you. The men advanced. Meyer took the position. Behind the legend that his admirers repeated as proof of military genius lay a record that post-war tribunals would document in detail and that historians have analyzed ever since. In Poland in 1939, under the command of units in which Meyer served, civilians had been executed. In Greece, his units had executed prisoners of war on at least one documented occasion in the village of Klissura. On the Eastern Front, the Leibstandarte had participated in massacres that formed part of the systematic pattern of Waffen-SS war crimes in that theater of operations, a pattern that the Nuremberg trials established as policy and not as individual excess. Meyer was not an anomaly within that system. He was one of its most efficient products. This was the man to whom Himmler and Witt entrusted the formation of 17,000 German adolescents. Meyer designed the training program at Beverloo with a brutal coherence that began from a correct diagnosis. The recruits had excellent bodies, physical conditioning superior to any conventional recruit, the result of years of systematic training in the Hitlerjugend. They had ideological motivation beyond any measurable parameter in a conventional unit. They had group cohesion built over years of shared camps and activities. What they lacked was real hardening, the specific ability to function with precision under enemy fire, to make correct decisions in fractions of a second when terror is so physical the brain tries to shut itself down, to keep advancing when the man who had been a meter to the right a moment ago has just taken a shrapnel round to the head and the remains are on your uniform. Meyer gave it to them with methods that any modern military code of conduct would have classified without hesitation as abuse. Recruits slept 4 hours. They marched 20 kilometers in full kit before breakfast. They ran combat exercises with live ammunition, not blanks, because Meyer believed that training with blanks taught soldiers not to fear gunfire, which was exactly the opposite of what they needed to learn. Armored vehicles maneuvered at full speed over trenches occupied by recruits lying on the ground to teach them to remain motionless when several tons of steel passed centimeters from their heads. Real grenades were thrown at distances that any safety manual would have considered unacceptable. Training casualties were significant and documented. Several recruits died in accidents during exercises. Meyer considered it an inevitable part of the process. A soldier who had not learned to control his own body under extreme pressure would die in his first real combat anyway, and his death would cost more because it would take others with it. But the physical training was only half the project. The other half, as systematic and as deliberate as the first, was the construction of a military identity that would make those boys psychologically capable of doing things that their own families and their own pre-Hitlerjugend culture would have called impossible. Every element of the Beverloo program reinforced the idea that the soldiers of the Hitlerjugend SS were different in nature, not merely in degree, from any other unit in the German army. The first Germans formed entirely within the National Socialist system from childhood. Not soldiers who had come to Nazism from outside and adopted it as adults, as most Wehrmacht men had, but men for whom Nazism was the only world they had known since the age of 10, for whom the Reich was not a government to which loyalty was owed, but the natural environment of all possible existence, like oxygen or gravity. The result of that combined process was a unit with military characteristics that Allied officers had not previously encountered on the Western Front, and which they would describe in their subsequent analyses with a mixture of professional respect and unease that official reports did not always manage to conceal entirely. Soldiers who would not yield ground even when doing so was the tactically correct decision, and every combat manual recommended it. Soldiers who counterattacked under conditions in which any other unit, including the best Allied veteran formations, would have pulled back to consolidate positions. Soldiers with a tolerance for their own pain and for the death of others that their own SS commanders described as exceptional even by Waffen-SS standards. And soldiers with a propensity to execute prisoners, to disregard the Geneva Conventions, to treat a captured enemy as a logistical obstacle rather than as a human being with rights, which was not an accident or an anomaly, but the direct and predictable consequence of what had been installed in them at Beverloo, and before Beverloo, in the Hitler youth camps. In January 1944, the division was ready for deployment. 15,600 men, with an average age of 18 and a real minimum age, undeclared, of 15 in some cases. The armament was first-rate by Wehrmacht standards at that moment. 200 tanks between Panzer IVs with long 75mm guns and the new Panther Ausführung A, whose 80mm frontal armor angled at 55 degrees was virtually impenetrable to the low-velocity 75mm gun of the Allied Sherman at any normal combat distance. Marder III and Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, towed artillery of 105 mm and 150 mm, mechanized infantry on SDKFZ 251 half-tracks, heavy 120 mm mortars, engineers, signals, logistical support. A full armored division on paper, comparable in order of battle to any elite panzer formation in the German army. The difference was that the men inside that equipment were 16 years old. They were transferred to France in the early months of 1944, to Normandy, to the region between Caen and Falaise, the Norman agricultural plains with their wheat fields and apple orchards and grey stone villages that within months would become the stage for the most intense land battle on the Western Front since the Somme in 1916. There they waited. They ran final integration exercises. Staff officers worked over maps of possible landing zones and drew up counterattack plans for the different scenarios. German command in the west, divided between Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who wanted the panzers close to the beaches to strike the landing in its first hours, and Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who wanted them held in central reserve for a flexible response once the main Allied effort was identified, had not resolved the debate. The Hitlerjugend's panzers remained in reserve, too far from any beach to act in the critical hours of the first day. On the 6th of June 1944, at 6:30 in the morning Central European time, the Allies landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. Operation Overlord. 156,000 men on the first day, 5,000 ships of all types, 12,000 aircraft. The greatest combined military effort in human history to that point, concentrated on an 80-kilometer stretch of Norman coastline between the mouth of the Orne to the east and the Cotentin Peninsula to the west. In the first hours of the landing, the Hitlerjugend SS remained motionless in its reserve positions. The order to move did not come until well into the day, and the reason for that delay is one of the most debated episodes of the entire Normandy campaign in terms of its potential strategic impact. Hitler was asleep at the Berghof when the first reports of the landing arrived. His aides, terrified by the consequences of waking him with news that might later prove wrong, did not do so until 10 in the morning. When he was finally informed, his first reaction was skepticism. He believed it was a diversionary operation, that the main landing would come at the Pas de Calais, where German command had been expecting for months, masterfully deceived by Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception plan that used double agents, false radio transmissions, and a fictitious army under Patton's notional command to convince the Germans that Normandy was the feint and Calais the real objective. The panzer divisions in reserve, including the Hitlerjugend, could not move without Hitler's direct authorization, and Hitler did not give that authorization until 4 in the afternoon of June 6th. By then, the Allies had been ashore for nearly 10 hours. The critical window in which the panzers would have found Allied forces at their most vulnerable, struggling to get off the beaches before they could establish a consolidated beachhead with artillery and anti-tank cover, had closed. When they finally moved, the first elements of the Hitlerjugend reached positions north of Caen in the early hours of June 7th. The principal adversary in that sector was the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, which had landed at Juno Beach the previous morning with the assigned objective of taking Caen that same day, and was advancing inland at a pace that threatened to collapse the entire German defensive line in the eastern sector of the landing. The Canadians were well-trained, motivated troops, some with actual combat experience from Italy and North Africa. They expected to encounter German infantry resistance and possibly a few isolated tanks. They did not expect to find a full SS Panzer Division with 200 operational tanks. The first significant clash occurred in the village of Utti, north of Caen, on the afternoon of June 7th. The Queen's Own Rifles of Winnipeg was advancing along Norman roads in march formation when the Panzer IVs of the 1st Company of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment emerged from the hedgerows bordering the lanes. The engagement was brief and of a brutality that Canadian survivors would describe in their subsequent statements with a precision that time did not soften. The Canadians were repulsed with severe casualties. 18 soldiers were taken prisoner. None of the 18 was alive the following day. They were executed during the afternoon and night of June 7th in the village itself and its surroundings. Some were shot in the back of the head. Some were deliberately crushed beneath the tracks of tanks. The bodies were found when the Allies recovered the ground days later. Subsequent Canadian investigations, which began in July 1944 in the field and continued formally after the war, identified the responsible unit, reconstructed the sequence of events using the testimony of German soldiers captured at various points in the campaign, and documented this first episode as part of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the entire Normandy battle. Simultaneously, and just a few kilometers away, in the hours that followed, the episode occurred that would define the historical perception of the division for decades and bring its most prominent commander before a war crimes tribunal. The Abbaye d'Ardennes is a medieval monastery on the northern outskirts of Caen, with an observation tower offering panoramic views of the battlefield and stone walls a meter thick that made it a natural command post. Meyer, newly arrived at the front and evaluating the tactical situation in real time, chose it as his personal headquarters in the first hours of June 7th. From there, he directed the division's opening engagements, coordinating the movements of his Panzer and Panzer Grenadier battalions with the speed and aggressiveness that were his recognizable tactical signature. On the 7th and 8th of June, at least 18 captured Canadian soldiers were taken to the monastery's inner garden and executed. Testimony from several German soldiers present at various moments, collected in Canadian post-war investigations between 1945 and 1946, is contradictory in certain specific details, but consistent in the general pattern. Prisoners were brought to the garden. They were briefly interrogated by an officer. They were then executed. Some testimony placed Meyer in the building or the garden during some of the executions. No testimony showed him personally shooting any prisoner. Whether Meyer directly ordered the executions, whether he consciously tolerated them without ordering them, or whether they occurred outside his immediate knowledge during a moment of operational chaos, is a question that military historians have debated for decades with divergent positions and no answer that all accept. What is not debated is the result. 18 captured, unarmed men with no possibility of resistance were executed in the garden of a medieval Norman monastery in the first 48 hours of the battle by soldiers who were mostly 17 years old and had been in their first real combat for less than 2 days. Think about what that means. These were not veterans hardened by 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front, where the atrocities of both sides had progressively eroded any line between legitimate fighting and war crime until it became unrecognizable. They were boys who 48 hours earlier had been sleeping in their reserve positions in the Norman countryside, and who now, in their first real experience of killing and seeing death, executed unarmed prisoners with the same matter-of-factness with which they had learned to fire at targets on the ranges at Beverloo. The brutality was not a residue of a long war. It was something they brought with them from the very first day, something that had been installed in them with the same precision and the same intentionality as the techniques for handling a panzer or the doctrine of fire and movement. Allied command took days to grasp exactly what it was fighting in that sector. The first intelligence reports describing the Hitlerjugend as a division made up primarily of 17-year-old boys were received with genuine skepticism by some staff officers who had difficulty reconciling that information with the ferocity of the fighting their units were reporting north of Caen. The skepticism faded progressively against the accumulation of evidence. By mid-June, the 2nd Canadian Army Headquarters had circulated an intelligence memorandum describing the Hitlerjugend SS as the most dangerous unit in the German order of battle in the sector. Not by virtue of material superiority, where the Panthers were clearly better than the Shermans, but not by insurmountable margins, but by their willingness to fight under conditions in which other units, even the best German veteran formations, would have requested permission to withdraw or would have begun surrender negotiations. The battle before Caen settled into a pattern that would last 5 weeks and consume men and material on both sides in quantities that Allied planners had not anticipated in their most pessimistic estimates. The Allies, with their crushing air superiority that made any movement of German armor during daylight hours suicidal, dominated the Norman sky from dawn to dusk. British Hawker Typhoons, with their 60-pound rockets, and American Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, with their 20mm cannons, destroying any column that moved on open road. The Hitlerjugend's panzers could only reposition at night, advancing without lights along secondary roads, while navigators used compasses and maps by the filtered light of a thumb-covered torch. By day, they hid beneath Norman apple trees and oaks, covered with camouflage nets and cut branches, waiting motionless while aircraft engines filled a sky that no longer belonged to them. The arithmetic of ground combat was more complex and less favorable to the Allies than the overall numbers suggested. A Panther could destroy a Sherman at 2,000 meters with a single hit on the frontal glacis. A Sherman needed to close to under 300 meters and find the exact angle to penetrate a Panther's side armor with the high-velocity 76mm variant of its gun, the improved version that the Americans gradually introduced through the summer and autumn of 1944. The standard low-velocity 75mm, which equipped most Shermans in June, was practically unable to penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at any useful combat range. Allied commanders had calculated the equation with the coldness that large-scale planning demands. They lost 3 or 4 Shermans for every Panther destroyed under normal combat conditions, but they had 10 Shermans in reserve for every German Panther in the theater of operations, and American factories were producing more at a rate German industry could not match in its best projections. The war of attrition favored irremediably the side with more to exhaust. The Germans knew it. They kept fighting. Fritz Witt did not live to see that equation resolve. On the 14th of June 1944, shells from Allied naval bombardment struck his command post on the outskirts of Caen. Allied cruisers and destroyers in the English Channel fired regularly against coordinates identified as German command centers and troop concentrations, often without direct observation of the impact, corrected by aircraft or from ground observation posts. A salvo struck the building where Witt was consulting maps with his staff. Witt took a direct hit from a naval artillery shell splinter. He died instantly. He was 36 years old and was the highest-ranking Waffen-SS officer killed in action during the entire Normandy campaign. His replacement was, to no one's surprise in the chain of command, Kurt Meyer. At 33, Meyer became the youngest Brigadeführer in the history of the Waffen-SS. The man who had trained those adolescents on the fields of Beverloo now took command of the division at the most critical moment of its operational existence. July 1944. The battle for Caen entered its most destructive and most costly phase for both sides. The cities and villages of Normandy that in spring had been places of normal civilian life under German occupation were now ruins. Caen itself, the medieval city with its abbeys built by William the Conqueror, was bombed by Allied aircraft on July 7th in an operation that destroyed the historic center and killed several thousand French civilians who had not managed or chosen to evacuate before the bombing. Whether that bombardment was militarily necessary for the capture of Caen, or was an error of disproportionate scale that destroyed a city which would have fallen anyway without it, remains one of the open debates among historians of the Norman campaign 80 years on. On July 18th, Allied command launched Operation Goodwood, the largest concentrated armoured assault in British Army history to that date. 718 tanks distributed across 3 armoured divisions, the 11th Armoured Corps, the 7th and the 4th, advanced south of the Orne Canal in a formation spanning several kilometers of front. The strategic objective of General Bernard Montgomery was either to break the German line directly and reach the plains south of Caen, where Allied numerical superiority in armor could operate without the constraints of bocage terrain, or, if the breakthrough failed, to draw all available German panzer reserves toward the British sector and thereby relieve pressure on the American sector to the west, where Operation Cobra was being planned for the following weeks. What Allied planners had estimated as a defense of 2 depleted German divisions south of the Orne was in reality a carefully constructed defensive system in depth, 8 kilometers thick, comprising multiple lines of dug-in anti-tank guns with interlocking fields of fire, artillery positions of all calibers arranged for direct fire against armor at maximum distances, and the surviving Panthers of the Hitlerjugend distributed in carefully chosen ambush positions among the apple trees and wheat fields. On the first day of Goodwood, July 18th, British armor advanced several kilometers, and the first German defensive lines yielded with significant losses of their own. Allied situation reports from that first day sounded like imminent victory in the headquarters. But the German defense in depth absorbed the blow without breaking at any critical point. By the third day, July 20th, the advance was stalled before the Bourgebue Ridge, where German heavy artillery halted any movement of armor in open ground. The operation stopped. The British had lost 412 tanks in 3 days. They had advanced between 7 and 12 kilometers depending on the sector. The strategic breakthrough had not materialized. Can you imagine what it is to be 17 years old and trapped inside a burning panzer in a Norman wheat field, while Allied fighter bombers circle your position in perfect orbits, and the loader who lent you his penknife yesterday to open a tin no longer has a face? The surviving tank crews of the Hitlerjugend described in post-war testimony engagements in which their panzer was the only operational one left in their company, surrounded by the twisted and still smoking wreckage that hours before had been the vehicles of their comrades from Beverloo. They kept fighting. They were all afraid, they said so clearly in the letters they managed to write home before they died. They kept going because they had learned nothing that told them another course was possible. After Goodwood, the numerical situation of the Hitlerjugend SS was critical. The casualties accumulated since June 7th were devastating. Of the 15,600 men who entered combat, by late July, the division had fewer than 6,000 operational. The panzers were decimated. Heavy artillery had been largely destroyed or captured. The replacements arriving from the Reich were younger still. The German recruitment system, under pressure that the planners of 1942 had never calculated in their scenarios, began sending to the Norman front boys of 15. Personnel records of the division, captured at the end of the war and analyzed in detail by historian Hubert Meyer in his official history of the unit, published in 1994, contain enrollment cards of recruits born in 1929 and, in isolated cases, in 1930. 15 years old. 14, in some cases, boys who had lied about their age at recruitment because they wanted to go, or who had been enrolled by local party officials who no longer bothered verifying documents because the front needed bodies urgently and bureaucracy was a luxury the situation could not afford. In early August, the German strategic situation in Normandy collapsed in a way that could no longer be concealed or minimized in any situation report. Operation Cobra, the American offensive, broke the German line west of Saint-Lô on July 25th, following a massive carpet bombing that leveled everything in the breach zone. The panzer divisions that had been containing the British and Canadians in the Caen sector were urgently pulled westward to plug the American gap. The move left the eastern flank exposed. By mid-August, German forces in Normandy were being enveloped from the north, with Canadians and Poles closing in from Falaise, and from the south, with Americans closing from Ardennes. The Falaise Pocket began to form with the ferocity and inevitability of a tourniquet. Inside the encirclement were more than 250,000 German soldiers, the remnants of the 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army, including what remained operational of the Hitlerjugend SS. The Allies were closing from the north with General Stanislav Maczek's 1st Polish Armoured Division and the 4th Canadian Armoured Brigade, and from the south with the American 5th Corps. The escape corridor between Chambois and Trun narrowed hour by hour as Allied artillery bombarded without pause and aircraft struck any movement on the roads. The retreat routes inside the pocket were blocked by thousands of abandoned vehicles, tens of thousands of dead horses, because the German army still used animal traction for much of its logistics, and the bodies of men who had not made it out. The smell of the Falaise Pocket in those August weeks of 1944 is described in the journals of Allied pilots flying attack missions from several hundred meters altitude. The smell of decomposing bodies in the August heat reached their sealed cockpits from the air. Kurt Meyer organized the defense of the escape corridor with what resources remained to him. The mission of the surviving elements of the Hitlerjugend in the final days of the pocket was to hold open the passes at Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives long enough for the maximum number of German soldiers to cross eastward before the encirclement closed completely. It was a mission with a clear tactical logic and a human cost that Meyer understood precisely before assigning it. Those who stayed to hold the corridor open were going to die or be captured. Those who withdrew had a chance to survive. Meyer assigned the most depleted units to defend the corridor. Someone had to stay so that the others could get out. The final combats inside the pocket, between the 16th and 21st of August, are described by survivors on both sides as the most brutal of the entire Norman campaign. The Canadian and Polish units closing the encirclement from the north found in every village and every farmhouse a resistance that, according to their own combat reports, exceeded any parameter that the tactical situation of the defenders could rationally justify. German soldiers of 17 counterattacked with half-functional tanks with ammunition for hours, knowing perfectly well that no reinforcements were possible and that the encirclement would close regardless. They counterattacked because the possibility of not counterattacking simply did not exist as a real option in the cognitive system that Beverloo and the Hitlerjugend had installed in their brains over years. On the 22nd of August 1944, the Falaise Pocket closed definitively. 40,000 Germans were captured. Approximately 50,000 had managed to escape eastward through the corridor, including Meyer and several thousand men of the Hitlerjugend. Approximately 10,000 German bodies remained inside the encirclement when the last positions were taken. What crossed the Seine heading east in the final days of August 1944 was not a division. It was the memory of a division. The Hitlerjugend SS entered combat in Normandy on June 7, 1944, with 15,600 men and 200 operational tanks. It emerged at the end of August with 600 men and fewer than 10 tanks, 3.8% of its original strength. It had lost virtually all its armored vehicles, all its artillery, its entire logistical infrastructure, and virtually all its intermediate commanders. Of the battalion commanders who had entered Normandy in June 1944, not one was present when the division crossed the Seine in August. All had died in combat, died in bombardment, been gravely wounded, or been taken prisoner. And yet, in purely military terms, measured by the cold criteria of operational analysis, the Hitlerjugend SS accomplished its mission. Caen did not fall until July 9th, 33 days after D-Day. Allied command had planned to take the city on the first day of the landing. That month's delay, significantly though not exclusively attributable to the resistance of the Hitlerjugend and the other SS units in the sector, allowed the bulk of the German army on the Western Front to reorganize defensive lines farther east and prolong the war in that theatre by several months beyond what Allied planners had estimated in their most pessimistic scenarios. The Allies did not enter Germany until the spring of 1945. They had expected to do so in the autumn of 1944. Those children stopped the Allies. They did not win the war. They could not win it, and some of them knew it, though they could not say so. But they delayed it, at the cost of their own lives, of the lives of 156 documented Canadian prisoners executed, and of an undetermined number of Norman civilians killed in the fighting and bombardments that the division's resistance extended weeks beyond what they would otherwise have lasted. The division was rebuilt in Germany during the autumn of 1944 at a pace that illustrates better than any speech the degree of desperation in which the Reich found itself at that moment. New recruits arrived in waves through October and November. Training programs that at Beverloo had lasted 6 months, considered insufficient by Meyer and Witt even then, were now compressed to 6 weeks. The instructors were for the most part the Normandy veterans themselves, the boys who had been 16 in June and were now 16 and 3 months old, with several months of real combat experience, trying to convey in weeks to other boys of 15 what they knew about surviving inside a burning panzer, about treating a shrapnel wound with the contents of a first aid kit, about how long one could remain motionless under artillery fire before the nerves gave out. In December 1944, the partially reconstituted division was incorporated into the 6th SS Panzer Army of Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich for the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last large-scale attempt at offensive action on the Western Front. The Hitlerjugend operated in the northern sector of the offensive, in the Elsenborn and Malmedy region, with the objective of breaking through the American front in the Belgian Ardennes, crossing the Meuse and reaching the port of Antwerp, which would split the Allied forces into 2 isolated groups and, in Hitler's logic, force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace that would allow all Reich forces to concentrate against the Soviets in the east. The offensive failed in its initial phase against the Elsenborn Ridge, where the 1st and 99th American Infantry Divisions held out for entire days against the attacks of the Hitlerjugend's Panthers and King Tigers, with a tenacity that German command had not calculated in its estimates of American resistance. The icy roads of the Belgian Ardennes in December 1944, the fog that grounded Allied aircraft during the first critical days, and the local German superiority in armor during that window were not sufficient to break a defense that clung to every ridge with the knowledge that falling back meant opening the road to Liège and Antwerp. It was in that context that the episode occurred which would define American perception of the SS divisions for decades. On December 17, 1944, not in the Hitlerjugend sector but in that of the Leibstandarte operating in parallel, a German column captured 84 American soldiers from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion at the Bonnier Crossroads near Malmedy. The prisoners were assembled in a snowy field. The tank machine guns opened fire. Those who tried to flee were pursued and executed individually in the snow-covered fields. 84 dead. News of the Malmedy massacre spread across the American front within hours. An unwritten order circulated from unit to unit with a speed no official communication could have matched. No SS prisoners were to be taken. Several hundred SS soldiers were executed by American troops in the following weeks in direct, documented reprisal. The war on the Western Front entered a different phase in that sector, one that historians have analyzed with discomfort for decades because it complicates the simple narrative of good and evil that the official memory of the war in the West preferred for a long time. The Ardennes offensive failed definitively in January 1945 when the weather cleared and Allied aviation returned to combat at full strength. The SS divisions were pulled out and sent by rail to the Eastern Front, where the Red Army had launched the Great Winter Offensive from the Vistula to the Oder that threatened to reach Berlin before summer. The Hitlerjugend fought in Hungary during the winter of 1945 in the last German attempts to hold the oil fields of the Lake Balaton Basin, which Hitler considered essential to the survival of the Reich. Operation Frühlingserwachen, Awakening of Spring, was launched on March 6th, with divisions that had fuel for days, ammunition for weeks at best, facing a Red Army with a material superiority of between 8 and 12 to 1 in that sector, according to the estimates of the German General Staff itself. The offensive failed in 4 days. The SS divisions were pushed westward. Hitler reacted from the Berlin bunker with one of his last documented explosions of personalized rage. He ordered that the Leibstandarte, the Hitlerjugend, and the other SS divisions of the 6th Panzer Army be stripped of their honor cuffbands as punishment for the failure. The cloth bands bearing the division's name embroidered on the sleeve, which SS soldiers wore on the left arm of their uniform as a mark of belonging, were to be removed as a sign of dishonor. Sepp Dietrich received the order at his headquarters. His response, which circulated in slightly different versions depending on the source, but whose essence no testimony disputes, was to send Berlin a campaign chamber pot with a message indicating that his men had shed enough blood to fill several of them, and that the cuff bands would stay where they were. The order was never carried out. Hitler did not respond. It was the first clear sign that the regime no longer had the energy or the authority to punish disobedience within its own chain of command. In April 1945, the remnants of the Hitlerjugend SS retreated westward through Austria. No one stated the objective in any official march order, but everyone understood it with the clarity that proximity to death provides. Surrender to the Americans before falling into the hands of the Red Army. The difference between the two fates was concrete and quantifiable for anyone who had been on the Eastern Front and knew what the Soviets did with captured SS men. The labor camps in Siberia and the Urals, from which a statistically significant proportion of Germans would never return. The Americans, by contrast, offered the Geneva Convention, food supply, basic medical care, and a real possibility of going home at some point in the foreseeable future. On the 8th of May 1945, Germany signed the unconditional surrender in Reims and in Berlin. The last identifiable elements of the Hitlerjugend SS surrendered near Enns, Austria, to units of General George Patton's Third Army. The American officers processing the surrender and registering the prisoners recorded in writing in several reports of the period the unease they felt, formalizing the capture of men whose identity documents showed them to be 15 years old. Some appeared younger even than that. Kurt Meyer was tried for war crimes in Orvich in December 1945 before a Canadian military tribunal. He was found guilty under the doctrine of command responsibility, sentenced to death, and the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He was released in 1954. He died in Hagen in 1961. He recanted nothing at any point during the 16 years he lived after the war. The majority of the enlisted men returned home between 1945 and 1946. The youngest were released more quickly. War crimes investigations focused on the officers. Enlisted men reintegrated into post-war Germany with biographies that many never completed out loud. Some found veterans' communities where the narrative was honor and sacrifice. A smaller minority carried something else. Erich Hahn, a half-track driver in the Hitlerjugend SS at 16 in Normandy and a hardware store owner in Bavaria in his adult years, gave an interview in 1989 that the German historian Gerhard Rempel cites in his work on the Children of the Reich. Hahn was 61 years old. I believed everything we had been taught, completely and without reservation. When I saw that we were losing, that Normandy was lost, that Falaise was lost, I couldn't understand it. It couldn't be that the system was wrong. If the system was wrong, then what were we? What had my entire childhood been? What had my friends died for? I didn't understand it until long after the war, and when I finally understood it fully, part of me would have preferred to go on not understanding. In the German military cemetery at Caen in Normandy, there are rows of low black crosses among oak and maple trees planted after the war. Buried there are more than 2,000 soldiers of the Hitlerjugend SS. Many of the headstones show birth dates of 1927, 1928, some of 1929. 50 kilometers away, in the Canadian cemetery at Benny-sur-Mer, rows of white crosses beneath a Norman sky that always seems on the verge of rain. Men of the Queen's Own Rifles of Winnipeg, of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. Their headstones show birth dates of 1920, 1921, 1922. The men who killed them were younger than they were. And that, more than any battle statistic, more than any analysis of military doctrine or any war crimes tribunal verdict, is what keeps the file of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend from ever closing. That the most efficient indoctrination system the 20th century produced took an entire generation of German children, built them an identity that left no room for any other, trained them to kill without hesitation, equipped them with the best available tanks, and sent them into the mud of Normandy at the age of 16 to do exactly what it had promised them for years they would do. And they did it.